I pressed my palm flat against the frost-covered window of St. Michael's Hospital, watching the January snow bury Edmonton street by street. It was the kind of cold that gets into your bones and stays there, the kind that reminds you winter in Alberta doesn't negotiate. Neither does cancer. Behind me, my grandson Daniel lay in a hospital bed that had become more familiar to me than my own kitchen table. He was 17, and he had the kind of laugh that filled a room from corner to corner. He hadn't laughed in 6 weeks. "Grandma," his voice came out thin like paper held up to light. "You've been standing there for 20 minutes. I turned around and tried to smile the way I used to smile when his mother brought him home from school with a scraped knee, back when fixing things was still within my power. "Just watching the snow," I told him. Liar. He almost smiled back. The doctors at the Cross Cancer Institute had given us a number. Not a prognosis, not a timeline, a number. $420,000 for an experimental CAR T-cell therapy trial that wasn't covered under Alberta Health Services. The treatment had a 68% remission rate for his type of lymphoma. Without it, they gave him 7 months, maybe 8 if we were lucky, and lucky was a word I had stopped trusting. I was 64 years old. I had spent 38 years as a registered nurse at the Royal Alexandra Hospital. I had a pension, a modest house in Sherwood Park that was almost paid off, and $82,000 in an RRSP I'd been too disciplined to touch. My daughter Karen was a single mother working as a pharmacy technician. She made decent money by most standards, but not this standard. We had started a GoFundMe that neighbors and old colleagues had been generous with, and after 6 weeks it sat at just under $30,000. It was generous. It was nowhere close. The morning everything changed, I was opening the pharmacy supply depot where I worked 3 days a week to keep busy in retirement. My supervisor Brenda met me at the back entrance with an expression I couldn't immediately read. Not bad news, not good news, just the face people make when something unusual has landed in their hands. "Dorothy," she said, "this was left for you at the front counter yesterday afternoon. Whoever dropped it didn't give a name." It was an envelope, thick cream-colored stock, the kind you don't find at Staples. My name was written across the front in dark ink, clean and deliberate. No return address. I opened it right there in the stockroom. "Mrs. Dorothy Hale, I am aware of your grandson's medical situation, and I believe I may be in a position to help. I have a proposition I would like to discuss with you directly. Please come to Harrowfield Estate, 14 Lakeshore Drive, Stony Plain, this Thursday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Come alone. This is a serious business matter. Edward Harrowfield." I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. What does it say? Brenda was already craning her neck. I folded it back into the envelope. "I'm not sure yet." Everyone in the region knew the name Harrowfield the way you know the name of a landmark you've never actually visited. The estate sat on 40 acres west of Edmonton, up on a ridge overlooking Lac Sweet Anne. Edward Harrowfield had inherited the property and a significant family fortune built on oil and gas infrastructure back in the 90s. He had been married once, briefly. There had been some kind of accident, the details changed depending on who was telling the story. Some people said a fire. Some said a construction collapse on one of his development sites. What everyone agreed on was that after the accident he had withdrawn almost completely. No public appearances, no charity galas, no interviews. His foundation still distributed money quietly to hospitals and universities across the province, but the man himself had not been seen at anything for close to 18 years. I Googled him that night at Karen's kitchen table while Daniel slept. There was very little. An old photograph from a business journal, probably taken in the early 2000s, showed a man with dark hair and a direct, serious expression. Some archived news about the Harrowfield Foundation's donations to the University of Alberta. A brief mention in a legal notice about an estate dispute that had been filed and then withdrawn. Nothing recent. Nothing personal. I almost didn't go. Karen told me not to go. She sat across from me with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea and said, very quietly, that she was afraid. I told her I had faced harder things than a meeting with an eccentric millionaire, which was mostly true, and that I was 64 years old and nobody's fool, which was entirely true. Thursday was clear and brutal, -22 with the wind chill. I drove my Subaru out along the highway with the heated seats on full and the radio off, and I rehearsed, the whole way, how I would say no if I needed to say no. The estate was exactly as imposing as the rumors suggested. The driveway was cleared and salted, lined with spruce trees that had to be 60 years old. The house itself was stone and dark timber, 3 stories, the kind of architecture that looks like it was built to last 2 centuries. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys. I sat in the car for a full minute before I got out. A woman in her 60s answered the door before I could knock. She had gray hair pulled back neatly, and the calm, unhurried manner of someone who has managed a complicated household for a long time. "Mrs. Hale, I'm Margaret, Mr. Harrowfield's housekeeper. Please come in. He's expecting you." The interior was warm and immaculate, but not quite lived in. Beautiful furniture, good art on the walls, fresh Douglas fir logs stacked by each fireplace. It reminded me of a heritage property that had been maintained to perfection by people who cared about the building more than they used it. Margaret led me through a wide hallway to a sitting room at the back of the house that overlooked a snow-covered garden. A fire was going. 2 chairs had been arranged facing each other across a low table. "Mr. Harrowfield will be with you shortly. May I bring you tea or coffee?" "Coffee, please." Black. She left, and I stood by the window and looked out at the garden. There was a path cleared through the snow leading to what looked like a greenhouse or a studio at the far end of the property. The glass was fogged from inside. Whatever was in there, something living, something warm, was being kept carefully. I heard him before I saw him, a measured, slightly uneven gait. Then he was in the doorway. He was taller than I expected, and older, closer to 70 than 60, with silver hair and a face that would have been called handsome once, and was now simply striking. He was dressed precisely dark trousers, a good wool sweater, leather shoes, and his hands. Both of them, despite being indoors and in a heated room, were covered in dark leather gloves. In my 38 years of nursing, I had learned to file observations away before drawing conclusions. I filed that one and kept my face neutral. "Mrs. Hale." He crossed the room and gestured toward the chairs. He did not extend a hand. "Thank you for making the drive in this weather. Please sit." I sat. He sat across from me. Margaret arrived with coffee, and then disappeared with the quiet efficiency of someone trained not to be part of conversations she wasn't invited into. "I'll be direct," he said. "I don't have a gift for small talk, and I suspect you don't have patience for it. You suspected correctly. Your grandson needs $420,000 for a treatment that isn't covered by the province. You've raised $30,000 through public fundraising, and you're running out of time and options." He said it evenly, without dramatics, the way you'd lay out a spreadsheet. "I can give you that money. In exchange, I need something from you." I looked at him steadily. "Go on." "I need a wife." The fire crackled. Outside, wind moved through the spruce trees. "I'm going to need more than that," I said. He nodded once, as if he had expected exactly that answer. "My cousin Patricia has filed a challenge with the Alberta courts, claiming I am mentally incompetent to manage the Harrowfield estate and the foundation assets. Her argument rests almost entirely on the fact that I live in isolation, have no social connections, and have not participated in public life in nearly 2 decades. Under the Wills and Succession Act, if she can establish that I lack the capacity to make sound decisions about the estate, she can petition for a trustee to be appointed. If that happens, she will liquidate everything: the foundation, the charitable trusts, the scholarship funds. She'll sell this property and distribute the cash. And a wife invalidates her case. A wife, and everything that comes with one. Social appearances, engagement with the community, evidence of a normal, functioning life. My lawyers believe that if I can demonstrate stable personal relationships and clear decision-making over a sustained period, her petition will be dismissed. He folded his gloved hands in his lap. "I need someone real, not an actress. The courts will scrutinize this. It needs to be a legal marriage, and it needs to be credible." "Why me specifically?" He met my eyes directly for the first time. "Because you are a retired registered nurse with a 38-year record of good standing. You are a widow, so there are no complications. You are respected in your community. You are not easily impressed by money. And you are in a desperate enough situation to take this seriously." That last part is fairly blunt. I find blunt more respectful than flattery. I looked at him for a moment. What would the arrangement actually require? You would have your own rooms here. No physical component to the arrangement. You would attend events with me as needed. A few charity dinners, 1 or 2 foundation board meetings where appearances matter, perhaps some visibility in the community. You could be with your grandson as often as you need. I'd arrange for his treatment to begin immediately, at the University of Alberta Hospital, with the specialists I already have a relationship with through the foundation. He wouldn't need to travel. And at the end? 1 year. Then we divorce quietly. You leave with the full treatment amount secured, plus an additional $40,000. I sat with it. The fire ticked and shifted. I need 24 hours, I said. You have until Friday evening. I drove home in the dark, with both hands on the wheel and the heater working hard and my mind doing something it hadn't done in a long time, which was spin. That night I told Karen everything. She sat very still through the whole account, and then she put her face in her hands for a moment, and then she looked up. Mom, he could be dangerous. I've assessed men in psychiatric holds at 3 in the morning in an understaffed ward. I can assess this one. That is not reassuring. He's not dangerous. He's lonely and he's scared and he's wearing gloves indoors, which means he's hiding something, but he's not dangerous. What does the gloves thing mean? I don't know yet. Karen made me promise to call her lawyer friend from her book club before I signed anything. I did. The contract arrived by courier the next morning. Sandra, the lawyer, spent 2 hours with it and called me back to say it was as clean and protective as she'd seen, clearly drafted by someone who knew what they were doing and wasn't trying to hide anything in the language. Both parties had clear exit terms. There was a confidentiality agreement that protected us both. The payment structure was ironclad. I called the number on the card at 7 o'clock Friday evening. I accept, I told him. 9 days later, I married Edward Harrowfield in a civil ceremony at a Stony Plain registry office. Margaret was there. His lawyer was there. I wore a deep blue wool dress I had bought at Holt Renfrew in downtown Edmonton because it was the only day I was going to do this and I was going to do it properly. Edward wore a charcoal suit and those gloves. After we signed the documents and the officiant pronounced us married, he looked at me and gave a single, careful nod. That was our wedding. Margaret showed me to my rooms on the 2nd floor that afternoon. A bedroom, a sitting room with a good reading chair by the window, a bathroom with heated floors. Everything was elegant and impersonal, like a very high-end hotel where no one had ever actually relaxed. Mr. Harrowfield takes breakfast at 7:30 and dinner at 6:30, Margaret said. He spends most of his day in his study on the 3rd floor and in the greenhouse. He prefers not to be interrupted during work hours unless it's urgent. Does he always wear the gloves? Margaret's hands paused on the folded towels she was setting out. Yes, ma'am. Why? That's not mine to share. She said it gently, not unkindly. But I think you'll come to understand on your own. The first 2 weeks were quiet in the way that empty houses are quiet. Edward and I ate breakfast together in near silence. He read the Globe and Mail in print, which I found oddly charming. I checked my phone for updates from the oncology team. Daniel had started treatment within 4 days of the wedding. Dr. Sharma called me every other day to report on his response. The early markers were cautiously positive. At dinner, we covered practical ground. There was a foundation gala in 3 weeks at the Fairmont Hotel McDonald in Edmonton. There was a dinner at the home of the foundation's board chair the week after. Edward briefed me on names and organizational history with the efficiency of a man who had once known how to run meetings and hadn't entirely forgotten. You'll need appropriate clothing for these events, he said one evening, not unkindly. I have clothes. Not for the Fairmont, you don't. He said it as a statement of fact, not a criticism. Margaret will take you. Send the receipts to my accountant. Margaret took me to Holt Renfrew and then to a small boutique on Jasper Avenue that I had walked past for 20 years without ever entering. I let the woman there dress me because I was 64 years old, and sometimes knowing your limits is a form of wisdom. I came home with a floor-length gown in deep green, 2 cocktail dresses, and shoes that cost more than my first month's rent in 1983. The gala was terrifying in the way that things are terrifying when you don't know the rules. Edward met me at the top of the stairs in a tuxedo, and whatever awkwardness existed between us in the house dissolved temporarily into a kind of professional partnership. He offered his arm. I took it. We walked in together. People stared. Edward Harrowfield, who had not attended his own foundation's event in 11 years, had arrived with a wife. The room rearranged itself around that fact. I discovered that I was better at this than I expected. 38 years of nursing had taught me how to speak to frightened people, proud people, grieving people, and powerful people, and most of a charity gala turns out to be some version of all four. I talked to the foundation board members about Daniel without being maudlin. I talked to the mayor's chief of staff about the Royal Alexandra's new oncology wing. Edward stayed close, his gloved hand occasionally at the small of my back. "You were extraordinary," he said in the car on the way home. I was adequate. No. He looked out the window at the city lights on the river valley. "You were extraordinary. Daniel's latest blood work came back this afternoon. Dr. Sharma wanted you to know his markers have improved significantly." I pressed my lips together and looked straight ahead at the road. "You've been following his file." "I funded the treatment. I like to know it's working." A pause. "He's going to be all right, Dorothy." He had never used my first name before. The third month brought a rhythm I hadn't anticipated. I spent mornings in the sitting room with books and correspondence. Edward worked on the third floor. In the evenings we began, without ever formally deciding to, having tea together in the main library before dinner. He would come down around 5 o'clock and we would sit on opposite sides of the fireplace, and sometimes we talked and sometimes we read in the same silence, which is a different thing entirely from the silence of strangers. He noticed I liked Canadian fiction. He started leaving books on the table in my sitting room without comment. Alice Munro, Alistair MacLeod, an old hardcover of The Stone Angel that turned out to be a first edition. I noticed that he handled everything with those gloves. Books, cups, door handles, his reading glasses. That he ate slowly and carefully, as if the act of holding cutlery required concentration. That on certain nights, when the temperature dropped, I could hear him moving around his study above me very late, unable to sleep. "Margaret," I asked one morning in the kitchen, "what happened to his hands?" She was cutting apples at the counter and she stopped, just for a moment. "I've worked for this family for 17 years, she said quietly. "He has never told me directly, and I have never asked him directly. But I've seen the specialists come here. I've seen the medications. And I know that whatever happened changed him from someone who was building things all over this province into someone who couldn't leave the house." She resumed cutting. "I think he'll tell you. I think he's been waiting a long time to tell someone. Patricia made her move in the 4th month. She arrived without warning on a Wednesday afternoon when I was in the front sitting room reading. I heard her voice in the hallway, before I saw her sharp, carrying, the voice of a woman who had always been let into rooms and expected the rooms to arrange themselves around her. She was Edward's age, well-dressed, with the particular kind of composure that exists right at the surface of fury. She stopped when she saw me. "So, you're the nurse he imported." "I live here," I said pleasantly. "Can I help you?" "I'm his cousin. I don't need your permission to be in this house." She stepped into the room, looking around it with proprietary eyes. "He's paying you, obviously. Did he tell you why he needs a wife all of a sudden? Did he tell you what he actually is?" "I think you should wait for Edward. He destroyed this family." Her voice dropped, suddenly raw under the composure. 20 years ago, he was running 3 major development projects across Alberta. He cut corners on a site in Fort McMurray. The scaffolding failed. 2 workers were injured and 1 man died. She watched my face. He was never charged. The investigation cleared him of direct liability. But he knew. He knew there had been warnings about that scaffold, and he overrode them because he was behind schedule. She stepped closer. And when the inquiry ended and he walked free, he took a belt sander to his own hands in his workshop. Both of them. Spent 3 weeks in hospital. And then he came here and he never left. The room was very quiet. "Get out." Edward was in the doorway. His voice was controlled, but barely. Patricia turned. "I'm going to prove this marriage is a transaction, Bobby. I've got investigators who've been talking to people in the community for 2 months. I'm going to take this to the court and I'm going to show them exactly what you are. Margaret." He didn't look away from his cousin. "Please show my cousin out." After she left, Edward stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then he walked to the back of the house without a word. That night I woke at 1:30 to the sound of something falling on the floor above me, a sharp crack, and then silence. I lay still for a moment and then I got up because 38 years of nursing doesn't uninstall easily, and someone above me was in distress, and I knew the difference between normal sounds and distress sounds. His study door was slightly open. The lamp on his desk had fallen and broken. He was on his knees on the floor, trying to pick up the pieces, and his gloves were off. I understood immediately why he wore them. Both hands were ridged with deep scarring, the skin uneven and silvered. The fingers of his right hand bent at angles that were clearly not how they had been designed. The left was worse, the palm distorted, the knuckles enlarged and irregular. He had done this deliberately and thoroughly, and it was not the act of a moment. It was the act of a man who had made a decision. "Don't," he said without looking up. His voice was very controlled, which meant it was costing him. "I'm not leaving." I came in and crouched beside him and began to pick up the larger pieces of glass. "Let me do this." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to." I kept my voice even, the voice I used for patients who needed calm more than they needed comfort. "I want to." He sat back on his heels. In the lamplight from the hallway, his face looked exhausted and old in a way that had nothing to do with age. "She wasn't wrong," he said. "What she told you." "I know." His name was Roy Deschamps. He was 43. He had 3 kids in Fort McMurray. He looked at his ruined hands, open in his lap. The site foreman flagged the scaffold twice. I read those reports. I told him to schedule an inspection for the following week because we had a concrete pour that morning and I didn't want to lose the day. His voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they have been broken and reset many times. He was dead before the inspection was ever booked. I sat on the floor beside him because my knees were 64 years old, and crouching was only going to work for so much longer, and because I wanted to be at the same level as him. "The inquiry found inadequate safety enforcement across the site," I said. "Not a single deliberate decision." "I made a deliberate decision. I chose the schedule over the report." "You made a bad call under production pressure in an industry where that happened constantly. That doesn't make you a murderer. It makes you someone who made the worst mistake of his life and has been sentencing himself ever since." I looked at his hands. "Those aren't penance. They're just damage." He looked at me. His eyes were dry, which somehow made it worse. "The doctors in Edmonton said there was a reconstructive option about 8 years after I did it," he said. "Partial function restoration." I refused. "Because you didn't think you deserved to use them properly again." "Yes." "That," I said, "is the most self-indulgent thing I have ever heard. And I once had a patient who refused his blood pressure medication because he said suffering built character." He stared at me for a moment. Then something shifted in his face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "You're not what I expected," he said. "Nobody ever is." I stood up carefully and held out my hand. "Get up, Edward. Tomorrow we're calling the Glenrose Rehabilitation Hospital, and we're finding out what they can actually do for those hands in 2024, because I suspect the answer is more than it was 8 years ago, and you're going to find out." He looked at my outstretched hand for a long time. Then he reached up with both of those wrecked, careful hands and took mine, and I pulled him to his feet. Something settled between us that night. Not dramatic, not announced, just the quiet shift you feel when a house stops being unfamiliar. He started rehabilitation the following week. Dr. Prasad at Glenrose was direct and optimistic in equal measure. The scarring was significant, but the underlying structure was workable. There would be pain and limited restoration, but there would be restoration. Edward sat through the first assessment with his jaw set and came out to the car and was quiet the whole drive home. "She said maybe 40% return of function on the right hand," he said finally as I pulled onto the yellowhead. "That's 40% more than you have now." "Yes." He looked out the window. "Yes, it is." I drove him to every appointment. We started talking on those drives the way you talk when you're both looking forward instead of at each other, which is sometimes easier. He told me about the development years, the ambition of it, the genuine pride he had taken in building things. I told him about the ward, the night shifts, the patients I still thought about, the ones I had saved and the 1 or 2 I hadn't been able to. He listened the way people listen when they have been alone a long time and have forgotten that other people's stories are as real as their own. He started leaving his gloves off around me in the house. Not always, not publicly, but in the evenings in the library, sitting with his tea. In the 6th month, Dr. Sharma called me on a Thursday morning while I was in the garden greenhouse that Edward had started showing me he grew orchids, which I found both unexpected and entirely fitting for a man who maintained delicate things in carefully controlled conditions because the world outside was too variable. I answered the call and stood between the orchid benches and listened to the doctor tell me that Daniel's most recent scans were clear. Complete response. No detectable disease. I sat down on the potting bench and I cried. Not quietly. Not composed. But fully. The way you cry when something has been terrifying you for so long that relief doesn't arrive gently, it arrives all at once. Edward found me there 10 minutes later. He stood in the doorway of the greenhouse with his bare hands at his sides, and he looked at my face and understood immediately. "Daniel," he said. "Clear scans," I managed. "Complete response." He crossed the greenhouse and sat beside me on the potting bench, and he put one of those scarred, slowly healing hands over mine, and he left it there. And we sat in the warm glass room with the orchids and the Edmonton winter on the other side of the glass. And that was the moment I understood that we were in significant trouble with our contract. Patricia's court date was set for month 9. Her legal team had been thorough. They had statements from 3 people in Stony Plain who said they had rarely seen Edward in town prior to the marriage and found the sudden change suspicious. They had documentation of the original reclusive lifestyle, the absence from public life. The foundation operated at arm's length. Her lawyer argued that a man who had isolated himself for nearly 2 decades and deliberately self-harmed could not be considered of sound mind to manage a multi-million-dollar estate. Edward stopped sleeping properly. He lost weight. The progress with his hands plateaued. I watched him withdraw incrementally each week, and I understood it. And I didn't allow it. "She's not going to win," I told him one night in the library. "She's making a credible argument. She's making an argument about who you were, not who you are." I set down my book. "You have been in rehabilitation for 4 months. You have attended 6 public events. You ran a foundation board meeting last month that 3 of the board members told me was the most focused and decisive meeting they'd had in years. You helped coordinate a donation to the U of A medical faculty that funded 2 new research positions. She's arguing you're incompetent based on an 18-year-old pattern. My cousin knows things about me that—" Edward. I said his name the way I used to say names on the ward, when I needed someone to stop spiraling and look at me. "Let the lawyers do their work. You just need to keep doing what you've been doing." The hearing was held at the Edmonton Law Courts on a gray March morning. Patricia's lawyer was skilled and organized. He walked through the years of isolation, the limited social contact, the self-harm history, the eccentric property management decisions. He called his witnesses. He built a picture of a man unfit for the responsibilities he had been given. Then our side went. Margaret testified about the change in the household since our marriage, speaking with the careful precision of someone who has observed things closely for a long time and knows the difference between performance and genuine change. The foundation's board chair testified about the board meeting, about Edward's clarity and judgment. Dr. Prasad testified about the rehabilitation engagement, the commitment, the measurable progress. Then I was called. Patricia's lawyer approached with the confidence of someone who believed he had already won. "Has Mrs. Harrowfield, isn't it true that you entered into this marriage specifically to obtain funding for your grandson's medical treatment?" I looked at Edward across the courtroom. He was sitting very still with his hands folded on the table, the left glove still on, the right one off, the way he'd started doing it since rehab, half and half, one step at a time. "Yes," I said. "That's how it started." So this was, at its core, a financial arrangement. "It was a contract," I said. "We were honest about that from the beginning. I needed help for my family, and Edward needed to demonstrate to the court that he was capable of living a full life. We were both direct about what we needed. That's not incompetence. That's clarity." "And would you characterize your relationship as a genuine marriage now?" I thought about the drives to Glenrose, the orchids, the first edition of the Stone Angel left on my sitting room table, sitting on the floor of his study at midnight, the potting bench in the greenhouse. "Yes," I said. "I would. And you can prove that?" "I don't need to prove it to you." I looked at the judge. Edward Harrowfield made a terrible mistake 20 years ago, and he has carried it every day since, in a way that most people never carry anything. He chose to punish himself rather than hide from what he did. That's not a sign of a disordered mind. That's a sign of a conscience. He has spent the last 4 months in serious rehabilitation, attending every appointment, doing the work, making progress. He has run foundation board meetings and managed significant charitable assets with full competence. He has helped coordinate care for my grandson and checked in on those results with genuine concern. I have seen him make good decisions under pressure and careful decisions under scrutiny, and I will tell this court plainly. Edward Harrowfield is one of the most clear-minded, principled people I have met in 64 years of life. He isolated himself because he was ashamed, not because he was incompetent. Those are entirely different things. The judge ruled in our favor. Patricia's petition was dismissed. Her lawyer was already talking about appeal options before they were out of the building, but Edward's lawyer was calm. The grounds weren't there. We drove home along the River Valley Highway with the late afternoon light flat and silver on the water. Edward was quiet for a long time. "You said things in there that weren't in the contract," he said finally. "No," I said. "I said things in there that were true." He was quiet again for another few kilometers. "Our year is up in 6 weeks, he said. "I know. I want to tell you something and I want you to hear it before you say anything." He kept his eyes on the road. "This year has been the first year in a very long time that I have felt like a person rather than a consequence. You did that. Not the arrangement, not the contract, you. Driving me to Glen Rose, sitting on the floor of my study, the way you spoke to the court today." He paused. "I would like you to stay. Not because of the foundation or the estate or any practical reason. Because I would like to keep choosing to be better, and I'm better at it when you're here." I watched the river. "What about Daniel and Karen?" I asked. "There's a suite of rooms on the East Wing that hasn't been used in years. It would need updating, but it could be a home for them if they wanted it. Karen can commute to Edmonton or find work closer. Daniel can finish high school at Stony Plain Central, which has an excellent science program. I've looked into it." He finally glanced over at me. "I'm not asking you to give up your family. I'm asking if your family would be willing to give me a chance." I thought about Karen's kitchen table and the GoFundMe page and Daniel's laugh that filled a room. I thought about 38 years on a ward and a pension and a house in Sherwood Park. I thought about what it felt like to sit in a warm greenhouse in January and have someone understand, without explanation, exactly what you were crying about. "I'll need to talk to Karen," I said. "Of course. And Daniel will have opinions about the school. I would expect nothing less. And I keep my own rooms." "Obviously. And you're going to finish the full rehabilitation program. No stopping at 40% because you think that's sufficient penance. You finish it." He almost smiled. Negotiated. Karen cried when I told her. First with worry, then with something softer. And then, after a long conversation at her kitchen table that lasted past midnight, with a kind of tired, cautious hope. Daniel, who was doing his homework on the couch and pretending not to listen, looked up from his textbook and said, "Is the greenhouse heated? Because I've been thinking about botany as a possible minor." We renewed our vows on a Saturday in May when the prairie was finally green. Margaret wore a dress she had apparently been saving for an occasion and didn't realize was this occasion until Edward told her. Karen stood beside me. Daniel, healthy and 17 and occupying more space in a room than seemed physically possible, stood beside Edward, lack sweet. Anne was visible from the garden, and the orchids were in the greenhouse, and it was nothing like a contract. Daniel is 19 now. He's in his first year of biological sciences at the University of Alberta, and he comes home on weekends and eats everything in Margaret's kitchen. Karen took a position as a senior pharmacy coordinator at the Stony Plain Medical Center and has recently started bringing a colleague named Thomas to family dinners, which Daniel finds very funny and Margaret finds very satisfying. The East Wing was renovated and it's theirs. Edward finished his rehabilitation program. He will never have full function in his hands, and he has made his peace with that, which is different from how he made peace with things before. He volunteers monthly with the Alberta Construction Safety Association, speaking to site crews about the gap between knowing a risk and acting on it. He doesn't find it easy. He does it anyway. The foundation is intact. The scholarships are still running. 2 nursing students at the U of A are in their 3rd year on Harrowfield bursaries, and I send them both notes at Christmas because that is the kind of thing I do now. And me? I garden. I read first editions. I drive the highway to Edmonton when Daniel needs picking up, and the river valley in the mornings is so beautiful it stops me every time, even still. I married a man I didn't know for reasons that had nothing to do with love, and I found out that the bravest thing he'd ever done was let someone see his hands. Sometimes you make a contract and you keep it, and sometimes you make a contract and you outgrow it, and sometimes, if you're very lucky and 64 years old and not quite done yet, the contract becomes the least interesting thing about the story. We chose each other, we keep choosing. That's all love ever really is.